Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I'm your host as always, Professor Prime. Today we're going to talk about math and scrubs. So here's how the video is going to go. I'm going to talk about the comedy of Scrubs. I'm going to talk about the more medical side of it. I'm going to talk about the meta elements of it and how math is used along the way, right? And I'm going to talk about my feelings on the show. For the record, it's one of my favorite shows, so I'm going to get into that. And I am going to talk about some characters. I am going to talk about the story to an extent. So feel free to assume, spoilers ahead. Okay. So with that in mind, let's get started. And again, spoilers ahead. So, with Scrubs, for the uninitiated, it is a sitcom that is medically based, right? A medical sitcom, as it were, right? And it ran for 9 seasons, almost for 200 episodes, running from like 2001 to 2010, right? And that's bonkers. Because I was there for a good deal of that, right? I mean, I was there for all of it in terms of it existing, but I jumped on a few seasons in and went back and watched everything, and then it was still going while I was well into it. So with that in mind, let's go into it further. Let's talk. Start with the comedy, and then kind of branch out from there, right? So for the comedy in Scrubs, it's an interesting thing, right? Because in those earlier seasons, notably that first season in particular, it was more on the dramatic side than the comedic side, but the comedy was definitely there. It just felt more surreal than anything. But as it got on, it got punchier, it got wittier, it got wackier. So it ends up being a different style of comedy by the end. But before talking about that further, let's talk about how comedy is inherently mathematical. You might not think that, or you may, I don't know, but it is. Let's start with the idea of a joke. Like, you have the setup plus the punchline, and that is equal to the joke. That is the basic formula. Now, you can play around with that formula, right? You can have those right ingredients, but there are other factors in play that, can help get that joke across. Because, right, we're dealing with timing for one. We're dealing with the way that joke might come across, right? Because we have some jokes that are spoken, some that are like visual, some that are ongoing. There are a lot of elements to it. But if we focus in on the delivery for something that's spoken, for instance, right? Like that alone could be interesting because there's math not only in that basic setup of a joke, but how it's delivered, the volume that someone is speaking at, their breathing, their timing, how they're using the words, and for other people involved, how that's getting across, everything. Well, not everything, but there's a lot of things like in a show like that where it is scripted that you have to consider. But there's some improv elements to it too. So it's like, oh, how do you blend that? How do you figure that all out? And that's one thing, right? And just so on a spoken level, there's a lot going on with it. The voice work, the breathing, the timing of the words, and just how it's all hitting. And then you have visual gags, or like more like the slapstick sort of stuff. And in either case, there's math and all that too, because you're considering the set, you're considering the actors, just where everything is, and you're considering the timing for everything to happen as it is. So you're dealing with things like location, you're dealing with things like timing, you're dealing with these different elements and objects coming into the picture, so to speak. And of course, if there's some sort of stunts involved, because it's a very physical joke, then there's math to consider in that and how it's going, right? Because you're considering motion, you're considering location, you're considering the speed of things. You want to like not have people be injured, and all of it takes work. And you might have stunt people involved if it's something on a little bit larger scale. And so all of those things are considered. And like with Scrubs, they definitely have some very physical based humor like throughout that, in addition to like the spoken word stuff, right? There's a lot going on with it, and I dig it. And so, just on a base level, what the joke is, you have something that's comedic, but then you have things like timing, and then you have different types of jokes. And there's only so much time that you're dealing with when you're dealing with a show, right? So, you have the idea that the show has a certain length in mind for it, right? And then there's like so much that goes into the filming of that, and having people read their lines right, having their location from each other right, and being able to just like film them correctly, right? Having the right camera work, the right lighting, the right sound editing, you name it. There's a lot at play there, and it could take a lot of time just to get some jokes for something that is, around a half an hour of television, 22 minutes or so. So not far off, right? Um, but there's a lot to consider just on that base level with delivering a joke. And then you have that idea with some of the things that I said being something that you have to consider whether you're filming a joke or not, right? Because you're having a show, you have a certain length to that show. And like with Scrubs, it runs with a half hour with ads, so like about 22 minutes or so, give or take. So of footage that you have to have like for each episode, so you have to decide how that's going to work, right? Because you have things like the characters, how they're speaking, the lighting, the costume designs, the set and how it's constructed, how it's composed, and like all of that is and takes math, right? And so you have all those things to consider, and the time that it takes to compose and edit everything. um, and that's worth considering. So you have that, and you're like, oh, okay, well, I have this episode, then I have like a certain amount of episodes per season, and then you don't necessarily know how long your show is gonna go, or even if you have an idea of it, it's like, hey, well, maybe the show is getting, decent ratings, and you have people and their jobs to consider, and all the money involved in general, and there's math and all of that too. And then with Scrubs, you got to figure, right, like it's not just any sitcom, right? There's always going to be like math in any given universe that you're working with, because that's just how math is. It's everywhere and everything, and it is everything. And with Scrubs, there's some ways that you can see that more clearly in universe too, because right, it's a medical sitcom. The doctors are doing doctor stuff, so there's a better way to say that. But the idea is right, like they've gone to school for years, right, and years and years, right, and they've gotten their degrees. And when we start the series, like we have that perspective from like JD, who's doing like the narration. He's an intern along with Elliot and Turk. You have characters like Carla and Dr. Cox, who have been there for a while, right? But the idea is these characters, they're going through their thing, um, and you have that focal point on ideas like, hey, we have a teaching hospital, and you have these people who went through medical school, have their degrees, and they're practicing medicine with some supervision, and they're doing things like running tests, and maybe some blood work. Maybe they're seeing if we have too little of this or too much of that. But all of that is math, right? And so they're running this test, running that test, prescribing this medicine and that medicine, and that's on the more general medical side. Then you also have the idea that, hey, surgery can get involved, and there's math in that. Just being precise with it. Like, hey, well, I might have to do this procedure, that procedure, remove this body part or that body part, and it takes time, it takes energy, it takes effort, and some precision, right? Because there's a lot going on in the body, and whether you're on the medical side or the surgical side, it's like you get to see a lot of things pop up, right, that we're considering. Because the thing is, the body is going to do what it's going to do, and the idea behind a lot of medicine is figuring out what that body is doing in trying to move forward, and math is the vehicle for that, is what everything is and is doing. And so it's cool to see that, and I feel like with medicine you can see that in a more visceral way sometimes, because it's like this math that affects your body, and it's making sense of the math that is your body, right? And you get to see that a lot in like Scrubs. They don't shy away from that, right? And I think that's cool. And then for some of the more metal elements, it's like a lot of the things that I have been saying. There's a lot to go into, right? And they also were, I think, like good with talking with actual like medical professionals. That doesn't mean everything in the show's gonna be accurate, but it's nice to like have consultants and like work with that. Um, Now, I could go on and on and on and on, and it's tempting to, but I do want to like I'm talking about my feelings with the show overall. Scrubs is one of my favorite shows. It's hysterical. Like I said a little earlier, the comedy kind of changes in a way, like right, because I think there's an element of it being surreal throughout, right? Because there's some there's like in the beginning, right? It's more dramatic, but like it can get more surreal, notably with JD's daydreams, right? But that's something that never really goes away. I just think they got like a lot wittier and wackier and had what they wanted to do more because in that beginning you could tell they were trying to be more, dramatic. And then, over time they kind of find themselves and distinguish themselves by being really funny. Like, and that was the goal at a certain point to be comedic. But there was like points where it differs, right? Like, and you get something more dramatic. Like, one of the things I like is like, like a lot of comedies, you get multiple storylines, right? And so seeing how those got managed were really cool, and I enjoy like the characters. And just to be clear, the characters on some level, all of them have aspects of their personality that are awful, but they're fun to deal with. JD is the de facto main character, but really it's an ensemble cast at the end of the day, right? Like, because I don't think the show works without a lot of other people, but like JD is funny. JD doesn't always say funny things, but he often does funny things, or just like seeing him stumble through life and making things worse for himself in ways where it's like, dude, you could have avoided this. Some of that can be funny. And Turk's a big part of the show too, and he often says and does some funny things. And like him and JD, they're best friends, and they're often doing funny things together, often pissing off some other people along the way. I did Carla. She was always like quick witted. And Elliot's always fun. Dr. Cox is straight up a horrible person, but he's also one of the most hilarious characters. And those are like a lot of the characters that the stories would tend to center around. And of course, like Dr. Kelso was a big part of everything because he ran the hospital, right? And there's always this idea where he's like, well, money, 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 we got to stay open. But then it's like, well, hey, what about treating this patient or that patient? And there's always this like balancing act. Um, but that being said, right, there are other characters that do pop up that are funny, but like those are like really the main ones, the ones that I mentioned. And whether it be a major character or a minor character, people tended to play their roles really well. Like if there was a point where someone had to be serious, they could be serious. When it became about being ridiculous and over the top, that people had no problem, going in and out of those roles, and I dig that. And I think like for the most part, right? Like for me, most of the seasons were decent. Most of the episodes were funny. I can rewatch them and have a good time. Now I think where it gets interesting, and I'm gonna talk about it, is the eighth season and the ninth season. And I say that because like the eighth season was meant to be and was filmed as though it was gonna be like the last season, and the season finale for season eight really works well for the series finale because from everything that I found, that was the intent. But then we got season nine. Now I want to be clear. Like, was season nine as good as the other seasons? I'd argue no. Some seasons like dipped in quality. Some were really good, but I don't think season nine was as good as those. And it was kind of meant to be another show, like a spinoff, right? Like med school, but it just didn't work that way. They ended up still making it Scrubs instead of a Scrubs spinoff. But it had that energy, it had that feel. Like, and instead of like JD narrating, you have like Lucy, and she's not a bad character. And honestly, like, I don't think season nine was bad. It's just that for me, season eight was really good, and it ended in an excellent way. Um, I mean, I would have liked to see JD and Dr. Cos go back and forth, because like it got to a point in there where Dr. Kelso retires through a whole bunch of stuff, and Dr. Cox kind of takes on that Dr. Kelso role, and JD takes on that Dr. Cox role. Um, so I would have liked to have seen more of that, right? But you know, either way, season eight ended strong, and then season nine came along, and it was like, this is okay. It's like it's different. It's a step down for sure, but it's not bad. Which I think some people think that it is. Like, it's not unwatchable. It's just like it's very different, and I do think it kind of undermines some character development. But that being said, there are 9 seasons of Scrubs, even though some people try to forget about that last one. But I do think it was good throughout, and there were some seasons where the writing was just like, holy crap, that is really good. And I remember getting into it around the time that I was in college, like back in 2005, and at that point, it had been on for 4 seasons, so I got to catch up on those like episodes, and then like it kept on going for 5 more seasons after that. So I had a good run, and like watched that largely throughout college, and then in well, I mean, I was already watching some of that in reruns. Like those first 4 seasons, I watched in reruns, and then watched like the rest of it live. But after that period, watching it and rewatching it periodically, there was a better way to say that. In any case, overall, I like Scrubs. The characters often did horrible things, but they also did some good things too. But above all else, they were interesting, and I can like go back to Scrubs and just like I can have some fun with it. Some jokes absolutely did not age well. I want to throw that out there, but a lot still works about it, right? And I dig that. It's just like if you haven't seen Scrubs, I do recommend that. Um, and it's like even though like Scrubs and Community are two different shows, and but two different things, God, I feel like if you like one, you're probably gonna like the other. Just putting that out there for any Community fans out there. But yeah, so Scrubs, one of my favorite shows. Still funny to this day. And it's crazy that it came out over 20 years ago. That is bonkers to me. I'll see you in the future.